"We are handing all 10 billion to Henry," Dad declared. "Now leave, you are exiled." I gazed at them in shock. "So you sold the company without my patents?" Mom chuckled. "We sold our business." The buyer stood up. "Actually, my name is Nia. I am 32 years old and the lead artificial intelligence algorithm architect for what was, until today, my family's robotics empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family that tried to steal your worth." The crystal champagne flutes clinked together in the center of the glass-walled boardroom, overlooking the sprawling Atlanta skyline. My father Marcus stood at the head of the massive mahogany table. His tailored suit practically radiated the arrogant authority he had cultivated for decades as the patriarch of our prominent African-American family. The ink on the merger and acquisition agreement was barely dry. OmniTech had signed a deal valuing our robotics firm at a staggering $10 billion, with the purchase money sitting in escrow until the required technology handover and closing conditions were satisfied. I sat in my emerald green velvet chair, swirling the red wine in my glass, waiting for the moment my family would finally acknowledge the sweat and blood I had poured into the company. Instead, my father cleared his throat and looked right through me. Before Marcus announced how the money would be divided, I asked one question about the patents and the work I had contributed. His expression changed instantly. He crossed the space between us and slapped me hard across the face. The crack of his palm against my cheek silenced the entire glass boardroom. My wine trembled in my hand, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Marcus returned to the head of the table as if striking his daughter were simply another item on the closing agenda. $10 billion, Marcus announced, his booming voice echoing off the glass walls. "The moment the escrow conditions clear, every dollar allocated to our side of the transaction will be transferred directly into the irrevocable trust account set up for Henry. As for you, Nia, you need to pack your things. You have until tonight to clear your belongings out of the company apartment. You are officially terminated, effective immediately. And as of this moment, you are exiled from this family." The air in the room vanished. I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me. My own father had just erased my entire existence with a single stroke of a luxury fountain pen. I looked over at my older brother Henry. He sat slouched in his expensive leather chair, adjusting his solid gold cuffs with a smug grin plastered across his face. Henry was the chief executive officer on paper only, a charismatic figurehead who spent more time networking on exclusive golf courses than he ever did in the server room. He was the golden child, the male heir my parents worshipped, while I was treated as the invisible workhorse. Before I could even process the magnitude of my father's betrayal, a sharp laugh broke the tense silence. My sister-in-law, Chloe, leaned forward across the polished table. Chloe was a white woman with perfectly blown-out blonde hair and a penchant for flaunting the generational wealth my family provided her. She reached out with her manicured fingers, snatched my company identification badge right off the table, and tossed it casually into the trash can. "Do not look so shocked, Nia." Chloe sneered, her tone dripping with absolute disdain and that familiar condescension she always reserved just for me. "You are just a code monkey who types away in a dark room. Henry is the face of this operation. He is the visionary who closed this deal. You should be grateful we let you hang around and collect a paycheck this long. Now be a good girl and go find some entry-level data entry job. I am sure someone in this city is hiring people with your lack of social skills." I ignored the venom spilling from Chloe's mouth and turned my gaze to the woman sitting elegantly beside my father. My mother, Vivian. She wore her signature pearls and an immaculate silk dress, projecting the image of the perfect high society matriarch of Atlanta. She reigned over the church committees and charity galas with an iron fist. Surely she would not let her own daughter be thrown into the streets without a dime. I looked deeply into her eyes, searching for a single shred of maternal warmth. "Mom," I said, my voice dangerously calm, despite the hurricane raging in my chest. "Are you really going to sit there and let them do this to me?" Vivian picked up her champagne flute and took a slow, deliberate sip. She did not even blink as she looked down her perfectly contoured nose at me. "Family is business, Nia," she said, her voice as cold as winter ice. You lack the polish, the presentation, and the social grace required for our new tax bracket. Henry is a leader. You are just a laborer. You simply have no commercial value to us anymore. The sheer audacity of her words washed over me like a physical blow. No commercial value. I set my wine glass down so hard, the crystal nearly shattered against the wood. The low vibration of heartbreak and anger inside me shifted instantly into something entirely different. It shifted into razor-sharp focus. I had spent 10 years letting them push me into the shadows, but I was not going to let them bury me. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly, making sure I held the attention of every single person in that room, including Sterling, the ruthless billionaire founder of OmniTech, who sat quietly observing the family drama unfold from the opposite end of the table. A laborer, I repeated, letting out a low, humorless laugh that made Chloe shift uncomfortably in her seat. That is truly fascinating. Tell me, Henry, since you are the visionary leader of this $10 billion company, do you even know what programming language the core neural network is written in? Can you even explain the basic architecture of the machine learning model that makes our robots walk? Henry scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. I do not need to know the nerd trivia, Nia. I manage the big picture. I manage the relationships. You manage the credit card debt. I snapped back, refusing to break eye contact with my brother. When I was 22 years old, locked in the basement writing the artificial intelligence algorithms from scratch, you were secretly draining company funds to pay off your massive gambling debts in Vegas. Mom and Dad have covered up your utter incompetence using my brainpower for long enough. My father slammed his heavy hand on the table, his face contorting with rage. How dare you speak to your brother that way in front of our business partners? Security will escort you out of this building immediately. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter woman. I did not flinch. I turned my attention away from the useless figureheads of my family and looked directly at Sterling. The billionaire sat with his hands steepled, resting his sharp chin on his fingers, his piercing eyes tracking my every move. He was a man who only cared about facts, logic, and legal ownership. I smiled a tight, dangerous smile. I have one very important question before I leave, I said, addressing the entire room, but locking eyes with my mother. So you finalized this $10 billion acquisition without my algorithm patents? The silence that fell over the boardroom was absolute. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit above us. Vivian rolled her eyes, adjusting her diamond necklace, and let out a patronizing chuckle. We sold the brand, you foolish girl, Vivian said, waving her hand as if swatting away a minor annoyance. We sold the hardware, the manufacturing plants, and the lucrative client contracts. The buyer has already signed the paperwork. The money is moving. The deal is done. You own nothing here. I crossed my arms and tilted my head, maintaining my unbroken stare. Without my code, those robots are just expensive pieces of useless metal. At that exact moment, Sterling, the tech billionaire who had just authorized wiring a massive fortune for the company, slowly stood up from his plush leather chair. The smug, celebratory smiles on my parents' faces began to falter as he calmly buttoned his suit jacket. Actually, Sterling said, his voice slicing through the tense room like a surgical scalpel. Before the billionaire could finish his sentence about the intellectual property assignment, my father swooped in with the practiced grace of a seasoned Atlanta businessman. Marcus had spent decades perfecting his deep, charismatic baritone. It was the same voice he used to charm venture capitalists and command respect at our church on Sundays. He placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Sterling's shoulder, letting out a rich, booming laugh that was designed to completely dismiss my existence. Sterling, my friend, please excuse my daughter, Marcus said, his tone dripping with a mixture of fake paternal concern and absolute authority. You know how these brilliant tech minds are. Highly emotional and completely out of touch with corporate reality. Nia is just throwing a tantrum because she wanted the chief executive officer title instead of her brother. But the ink is dry, the hardware is pristine, our client contracts are ironclad. The code she is talking about is fully owned by our family enterprise. Everything will be handed over to your engineering team first thing Monday morning as agreed. Now why do we not head down to the Buckhead Club? I have a box of vintage Cuban cigars waiting for us to celebrate this monumental acquisition. Sterling narrowed his cold gray eyes, looking between me and my father. He was a ruthless businessman, but he was also eager to close this deal and take control of the robotics market. The promise of the physical hard drives and Marcus's overwhelming confidence seemed to satisfy his immediate legal concerns. Sterling gave a curt nod, buttoned his jacket, and walked out the glass doors without giving me a second glance. My father followed close behind him, leaving me alone with the true monsters of my family. The moment the heavy boardroom doors clicked shut behind the billionaire, the fake smiles dropped. The air in the room grew completely toxic. My mother Vivian stood up from her chair, smoothing down the front of her expensive silk dress. The elegant high society matriarch vanished, replaced by a woman who looked at me as if I were a stain on her perfect legacy. She snapped her fingers toward the two massive private security guards standing near the entrance. "Get her out of my sight!" Vivian ordered, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage. "You ungrateful, wretched girl! You almost ruined the biggest financial triumph in the history of this family. We gave you everything. We clothed you, fed you, and let you play on your computers, while your brother was out building the actual brand. And you try to sabotage us in front of a $10 billion buyer. Drag her out of here. If she resists, call the police and tell them a disgruntled former employee is trespassing." I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me panic. As the two heavily built security guards stepped forward, grabbing me roughly by both arms, I kept my posture completely straight. I looked right past them, locking eyes with my mother. "You just sold a hollow shell," I told her, my voice echoing in the empty boardroom. "You sold a fleet of expensive metal bodies with no brains. And when the fallout comes, do not expect me to save you." Chloe leaned against the mahogany table, flashing her perfect white teeth. "Bye, Nia," she mocked, waving her manicured hand. "Have fun in the real world. Do not forget to apply for unemployment." Henry just laughed, running a hand over his expensive haircut. "Send me a postcard from the bottom, sis." The guards yanked me backward, forcing me out of the boardroom and marching me down the long corporate hallway. Employees I had worked alongside for years peeked out of their cubicles, their eyes wide with shock as the lead algorithm architect was paraded through the office like a common criminal. No one said a word. The culture my parents had built was one of absolute fear and compliance. If you crossed Marcus and Vivian, you ceased to exist. I kept my chin high, refusing to let a single tear fall. They shoved me into the executive elevator and hit the lobby button. The heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off my view of the company I had helped build from the ground up. As the elevator rapidly descended, the silence was deafening. The adrenaline that had been keeping me steady slowly began to recede, leaving behind a cold, harsh reality. I was entirely alone. My family had just traded me for $10 billion, and they had not lost a single second of sleep over it. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened to the expansive marble floor of the ground-level lobby. The guards marched me past the reception desk and pushed me out through the revolving glass doors onto the bustling downtown Atlanta street. The humid Georgia air hit my face instantly. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the security guards cross their arms and take their positions behind the glass, making it clear I was never to set foot in that building again. I reached into my blazer pocket to pull out my phone, intending to call a rideshare service to take me back to my company-owned apartment. But as soon as the screen illuminated, a barrage of notifications began flooding my lock screen. The rapid succession of alerts sounded like a ticking time bomb. I opened my banking application and my heart skipped a beat. My corporate American Express card, the one used for work expenses and daily company-authorized spending, was marked as canceled. A second company-linked reimbursement account had also been disabled. My separate personal checking account was still legally mine, but after years of letting the family route most of my compensation through contractor invoices and corporate benefits, the immediately available balance was painfully small. They had not magically seized my private money. They had done something crueler and more calculated. They had cut off every company-controlled financial convenience at once, expecting the sudden pressure to force me back into line. They had not just fired me, they had financially executed me. Within the span of 20 minutes, my parents had stripped me of my job, my family status, and my entire financial lifeline. I stood on the crowded sidewalk, gripping my phone as pedestrians brushed past me, completely unaware that my world had just been systematically dismantled. I had $12 in my wallet and the clothes on my back. A chilling realization suddenly washed over me. Vivian and Marcus were greedy, but Henry was a coward. He knew he had promised Sterling the physical hard drives by Monday morning. He also knew he had absolutely no idea how to compile the core source code or transfer the proprietary artificial intelligence architecture. Henry was lazy, and he always looked for the easiest shortcut. If he realized I was a threat, he would not wait until Monday to secure the assets. He would go straight to the source. My apartment. The luxury loft was technically registered under the company name. All of my personal computer servers, my backup drives, and my physical encryption keys were sitting right there in my home office. If Henry managed to get his hands on my physical drives, he could simply hand them over to OmniTech and collect his $10 billion payday without ever needing my permission. They would lock me out, steal my life's work, and leave me to rot. I flagged down a passing taxi, practically throwing myself into the back seat. I handed the driver a crumpled $10 bill and gave him my address, telling him to step on the gas. The drive through the city traffic felt agonizingly slow. My mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios, calculating my next move with the same ruthless precision I used to write code. My family thought they had broken me. They thought cutting off my money and throwing me into the street would force me to surrender. They severely underestimated the monster they had created. The taxi screeched to a halt outside the towering glass facade of my Buckhead apartment building. I tossed the crumpled bills at the driver and sprinted through the revolving doors. The grand marble lobby, normally a place where I was greeted with warm smiles, felt entirely hostile. The head concierge, a man I had tipped generously for 6 years, instantly dropped his gaze to his computer screen as I rushed past the front desk. My father had clearly already made the phone calls. The building management knew I was a dead woman walking. I did not wait for the private elevator. I pushed through the heavy fire doors and bolted up the 3 flights of stairs to my floor, my breath burning in my lungs. When I reached the end of the corridor, my heart slammed against my ribs. The heavy mahogany door to my luxury loft was propped wide open. The unmistakable high-pitched whine of a power drill echoed from inside. I stepped into the foyer, and the sight before me was a masterclass in entitlement and greed. My living room had been completely ransacked. Sofa cushions were tossed onto the floor, and my bookshelf had been pulled away from the wall, exposing the hidden steel safe embedded in the drywall. A hired locksmith wearing grease-stained overalls was currently driving a heavy-duty titanium drill bit straight into the locking mechanism. Standing right behind him, supervising the destruction of my personal property, was my brother Henry. He had already managed to loosen his expensive silk tie, sweating profusely in his tailored suit. Beside him, lounging against my kitchen island, as if she were at a cocktail party, was Chloe. She was casually sipping from a bottle of my expensive sparkling water, resting a brand-new exotic crocodile skin Birkin bag on the pristine quartz countertop. "Make it fast," Henry, she whined, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "I have a private fitting at Neiman Marcus in an hour, and we still need to view that yacht in Miami this weekend." I stepped fully into the room, my voice cutting through the abrasive noise of the drill. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Henry spun around, but he did not look guilty. He looked absolutely elated. He signaled the locksmith to stop drilling and crossed his arms, leaning back on his heels with that signature arrogant smirk he always used to belittle me. "We are reclaiming company property, Nia," he declared smoothly. "Sterling wants his engineering team to review the compiled architecture by Monday morning. I need the physical hard drives. I need the core source code. Now tell this guy the combination to the safe, or I will let him tear the entire wall down." I stared at the man who shared my blood, completely disgusted by his profound ignorance. "You are the chief executive officer," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "You have stood on stages for 5 years, accepting awards for artificial intelligence innovation. You gave keynote speeches about machine learning and dynamic neural networks. And you actually think the core source code for a $10 billion robotics infrastructure is locked inside a metal box in a residential apartment." Henry's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes darted nervously around the room, searching the scattered electronics and dismantled computer towers. He was a fraud. He had always been a fraud. He did not know the first thing about data compilation or server architecture. My parents had spoon-fed him his entire career, hiding his staggering incompetence behind my relentless labor. "Stop stalling, Nia," Chloe interrupted, pushing herself off the kitchen island. She walked toward me, designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and held up the exotic Birkin bag in my face. "Do you see this $50,000? Marcus authorized Henry to draw celebration money from a company bridge account against the expected OmniTech closing. The adults are doing business now. Give Henry the drive so we can hand it over to Sterling and finally get rid of you for good." I looked at Chloe, noting the absolute transactional nature of her existence. She had married into my wealthy African-American family solely for the access, the privilege, and the limitless credit cards. She despised me because I represented the actual hard work that funded her luxurious lifestyle. I turned my attention back to Henry. He was growing impatient, glancing frantically at the multiple computer monitors on my workstation. I was desperate. He needed a physical object to hand to Sterling to prove his worth, to prove he was actually the genius my parents claimed he was. If he showed up empty-handed on Monday, Sterling would start asking questions. I knew exactly how to play this. I let my eyes widen just a fraction, injecting a perfectly calculated dose of panic into my expression. I darted my gaze toward the sleek, matte black solid-state drive sitting conspicuously next to my keyboard. It was a subtle movement, but Henry caught it. His predatory instincts flared. I gasped and made a sudden, desperate lunge toward my desk. "Get away from my workstation," I yelled, reaching my hand out. "You cannot take that. It is the master key." Henry reacted exactly as I knew he would. Believing he had just discovered the holy grail of our $10 billion empire, he charged at me. I was taller and much heavier, and he used his full body weight to intercept me. He grabbed my wrist, twisting it painfully, and shoved me violently backward. I lost my footing and crashed hard into the edge of the glass coffee table, crying out as a sharp pain radiated through my shoulder. I crumpled to the floor, clutching my arm, putting on the performance of a lifetime. I stared up at him with wide, terrified eyes, begging him to stop. Henry stood over me, breathing heavily but grinning like a conqueror. He reached out and snatched the black solid-state drive off the desk, holding it up in the air, as if he had just won a gold medal. "Got it," he breathed, his eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. The master key. I tossed a crumpled $100 bill at the bewildered locksmith, telling him to pack up his tools and get out. Henry slipped the black drive carefully into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, treating it like the most precious artifact in the world. "Let us go, Chloe," he commanded, adjusting his jacket. "We have a $10 billion handover to prepare for." Chloe stepped right over me, her expensive perfume making my stomach turn. She looked down at me, sprawled on the floor, nursing my shoulder. "Clean out your desk by midnight, Nia," she sneered, kicking my discarded mail out of her path. "Or I will have the building staff throw your garbage into the dumpster." The heavy mahogany door slammed shut behind them, locking with a loud, definitive click. The apartment fell into a dead silence. I remained on the floor for 10 full seconds, listening to the fading sound of their footsteps down the corridor. When I was absolutely certain they were gone, the mask of terror completely melted off my face. I sat up, ignoring the dull ache in my shoulder, and dusted off my trousers. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. I threw my head back and let out a genuine loud laugh that echoed through the ransacked apartment. Henry was a fool, a predictable, greedy little fool. The black drive he had just violently stolen from me did not contain the artificial intelligence algorithm. It did not contain the core source code. It did not contain a single line of useful data. It contained a localized, self-executing security routine I had designed years ago for isolated testing environments. Internally, I called it the wipeout protocol. The routine was meant to destroy only the temporary deployment image loaded from that drive when the package was opened outside an authorized license container. It carried decoy files, not my real algorithm. It was not a worm designed to attack a live corporate network. It was a locked emergency wipe for a disposable test environment, and Henry had just stolen it, believing it was the master key. When my arrogant brother walked into OmniTech headquarters on Monday morning and proudly plugged that drive into the acquisition test system, it would not initialize a robotic sequence. In a properly isolated validation environment, the security routine would recognize an unauthorized deployment and wipe only the temporary demonstration image created from the decoy package. the production network would remain safe. What Henry would destroy in seconds was the handover demo he needed to prove he possessed my technology. They thought they had robbed me. They thought they had secured their $10 billion future. They had no idea they had just walked out of my apartment carrying the exact weapon that was going to burn their entire empire to the ground. I stepped over the shattered glass of my coffee table, the sharp crunch echoing in the sudden quiet of the loft. There was no time for tears. Tears were a luxury for people who had a safety net, and my parents had just set mine on fire. But they forgot one crucial detail. You cannot burn someone who controls the ignition switch. I walked past the destroyed wall safe, completely ignoring the mess the locksmith had made. Henry was so blinded by his own arrogance, he never stopped to ask why a tech architect would store her lifework in a traditional metal box. I moved to the heavy Persian rug near the floor-to-ceiling windows and pushed it aside. I counted 3 oak floorboards from the left edge and pressed my palm against the wood, feeling for the imperceptible groove. With a hard downward push, the board clicked and popped open, revealing a shallow, dust-free cavity, perfectly insulated from the rest of the apartment. Inside lay a waterproof biometric lockbox. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. A tiny green light flashed and the lid popped open. Inside was a sleek, unmarked silver laptop and a thick, heavy manila folder. This was my real vault. There were no corporate letterheads or OmniTech watermarks on these pages. These were my original filings, my raw mathematical proofs, and the absolute holy grail of this entire operation. The original freelance contractor agreements. For 6 years, my parents had refused to make me an official employee of our robotics firm. Marcus and Vivian were obsessed with keeping my compensation off the regular payroll and funneling maximum capital into Henry's extravagant lifestyle. They paid me through independent contractor agreements, issued tax forms accordingly, and treated my coding work as an outside vendor expense. What mattered was not the label alone. The contracts contained no invention assignment, no software-specific work, made-for-hire language that transferred my rights, and no later instrument assigning my patents or copyright to the family company. I had also filed the core patent rights through my own limited liability company. Their attempt to save money and keep me invisible had left a catastrophic hole in the ownership chain. I packed the silver laptop and the thick folder into a nondescript canvas duffel bag. I grabbed 3 days' worth of practical dark clothing and stuffed them inside. I left the shattered apartment exactly as it was. I did not bother looking back at the expensive furniture, the designer artwork, or the panoramic view of the Buckhead skyline. My parents could keep the empty shell of my life, just like they kept the empty shell of the robotics company. By sunset, I was miles away from the elite gated communities and country clubs my family ruled. I took 3 different buses, making sure I was not followed, and paid cash for a room at a rundown motel on the deep outskirts of Atlanta. The neon vacancy sign flickered aggressively against the humid Georgia night sky, illuminating the cracked pavement of the parking lot. The room smelled of old bleach and stale smoke, but it had a heavy deadbolt and thick blackout curtains. It was completely off the grid, perfect. I locked the deadbolt, closed the curtains, and sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. I booted up the silver laptop. It bypassed standard commercial operating systems, loading directly into a heavily encrypted dark network I had built specifically for this exact scenario. I needed a legal strike team, but I could not use anyone in Atlanta. Marcus and Vivian had spent decades buying influence in this city. Every major law firm in the state either played golf with my father, sat on a charity board with my mother, or attended their massive church. I opened a secure communication channel and typed in a specific address. I reached out to a notoriously ruthless intellectual property law firm based in Washington District of Columbia. They specialized in high-stakes corporate litigation, hostile takeovers, and intellectual property theft. They were apex predators who did not care about the social standing of an elite Atlanta family. They only cared about the law and the money. I drafted a precise message to the senior managing partner. I outlined the $10 billion acquisition, the missing intellectual property assignment, the failed ownership chain, and the danger that my family had signed, closing representations they could not support. I explained that if those statements were knowingly false and transmitted to obtain the acquisition money, the record could create serious civil fraud exposure and potentially support a wire fraud referral. To prove I was not simply a disgruntled former contractor, I attached cryptographic proof of authorship, my patent records, and a scanned copy of the contractor agreement. I hit send and watched the progress bar disappear into the encrypted void. The waiting was the hardest part, but I knew the bait was too lucrative for a Washington shark to ignore. $10 billion was on the line, and I held the only key to the vault. While I sat in that dimly lit motel room waiting for a response, my mind drifted to Henry and Chloe. They were probably out right now, sipping $1,000 champagne and browsing real estate listings for their new Miami yacht. Henry probably had that black solid-state drive sitting in his breast pocket, treating it like a trophy. He had absolutely no idea what was actually inside it. I did not know the wipeout protocol was a decoy security routine designed to erase the temporary software image created from that drive when it was deployed in an unauthorized test environment. If OmniTech followed normal validation procedure and tested unfamiliar media inside an isolated demonstration cluster, the production network would remain untouched. But the handover demo would collapse in seconds, and Sterling would discover that Henry had brought him no usable source code at all. The ping of an incoming message pulled me from my thoughts. I looked at the encrypted screen. The response had come through in less than 20 minutes. The senior partner of the Washington firm was not just reviewing my file. He had immediately assembled a crisis team. The message requested a secure video link for first thing tomorrow morning and instructed me not to speak to anyone else. They recognized the sheer magnitude of the fraud my parents had committed. I closed the laptop and lay back on the cheap motel bed, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. A slow, steady rhythm settled into my chest. The fear and panic my family had tried to instill in me were completely gone. They had cast me out into the cold, hoping I would freeze. But they forgot that I was the one who built the fire in the first place. The trap was set, the legal war room was assembling, and the countdown to Monday morning had officially begun. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 10 years, I slept peacefully, knowing my family was walking blindly into a slaughter. Monday morning arrived with the sterile confidence of a billion-dollar corporation expecting to receive the future on schedule. At OmniTech headquarters, an entire demonstration floor had been sealed for the technology handover. Engineers stood behind glass partitions. Executives filled a tiered presentation room. Cameras were prohibited. Phones were collected at the door, and a mirrored test environment had been built specifically so the incoming robotics software could be validated without touching OmniTech's live production network. Sterling sat in the center of the front row with his arms folded. He did not look celebratory. He looked like a man waiting to see whether the $10 billion promise he had bought could survive contact with reality. Henry walked in carrying the matte black drive inside a padded presentation case. My brother had always understood theater better than technology. He wore a new suit, a new watch, and the confident smile of a man who believed possession was the same thing as ownership. Marcus and Vivian followed him, both polished enough for a magazine cover. Chloe came last, holding the Birkin she had flaunted in my apartment and whispering excitedly about Miami, as if the money in escrow had already become family cash. Sterling did not bother with small talk. "Where is the operational source package?" Henry placed the black drive on the demonstration table. "Right here," he said. "Complete core architecture. Neural network controls, adaptive motion engine, predictive decision layer. Everything OmniTech purchased." One of OmniTech's engineers looked at him. "And the build instructions, dependency map, encryption credentials." Henry's smile tightened. "They are embedded. Nia always overcomplicated the documentation. The system practically deploys itself." Marcus stepped in before anyone could ask another technical question. "My son is being modest. Our platform was designed for seamless integration. You wanted a turnkey system, Sterling. That is exactly what we are delivering." Sterling's eyes remained on the drive. "Then demonstrate it." The room went silent. Henry picked up the drive and walked toward the isolated validation console. For the first time, I imagine a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. He had stolen a physical object from my desk because he thought genius could be carried away in a jacket pocket. He had never asked why I had lunged for that particular drive. He had never verified what was on it. He had simply assumed that if I wanted it, it had to be valuable. That assumption was about to cost him everything. The engineering director reminded everyone that the validation cluster was sandboxed from OmniTech's production systems. It contained only the temporary demonstration image prepared for the acquisition test. Henry nodded impatiently, as if the explanation bored him. He inserted the drive. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the 60-foot display at the front of the room flashed from blue to red. Unauthorized deployment environment detected. A warning tone sounded. Henry froze. What is that? A second line appeared. Secure wipe protocol armed. Sterling stood. Do not touch anything. Henry immediately touched everything. He grabbed the mouse, clicked through 2 windows, hit escape, then yanked at the drive. One of the engineers shouted for him to stop, because the test image was already executing a local security routine. The screen displayed a countdown. 3. The mirrored robotics dashboard vanished. 2. The copied model libraries disappeared from the validation cluster. 1. Every file inside the isolated AI demonstration environment was overwritten. The temporary configuration table collapsed, and the display went completely black. 3 seconds. That was all it took. The production network was safe because OmniTech's engineers had done exactly what competent engineers do when testing unfamiliar code. They had isolated the handover environment. But the entire AI demonstration platform prepared for the $10 billion acquisition was gone. More importantly, the black drive contained no operational algorithm at all. No neural network, no source repository, no encryption keys. Nothing Sterling could use to make 50,000 robotic chassis think, balance, learn, or move. The room erupted. Engineers began calling out checksums and recovery commands. The display rebooted into a bare diagnostic shell. Henry stood in front of it, holding the useless drive like a weapon that had fired backward. Sterling rose so fast, his chair scraped across the floor. What did you just plug into my system? Henry's lips moved before sound came out. It is her fault. Sterling stared at him. Henry pointed at the drive. Nia sabotaged it. She planted something on the hardware. She knew we would need the master package. Marcus hurried forward, palms open. Sterling, this is an unfortunate security feature. A family dispute triggered a protection mechanism. Give us a few hours. We will reset the environment and deliver the correct package. One of OmniTech's engineers turned from the console. There is nothing to reset from this device. The drive carried a local wipe routine and decoy files. It does not contain the source package described in the acquisition schedule. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Sterling picked up the tablet resting beside his chair. He opened the closing checklist and scrolled to the intellectual property delivery condition. His jaw tightened with every line. Then he threw the tablet. It struck the padded presentation wall with a violent crack and fell to the carpet. $10 billion, he said almost quietly. I have $10 billion sitting in escrow behind representations that your company owns and can deliver a functioning technology stack. I asked one question on Friday. Your daughter raised an intellectual property issue and you told me it was handled. Vivian stepped forward with the polished smile she used at charity galas. Nia is emotional. She has always had difficulty separating family disappointment from professional responsibility. We can bring her back into the company. Sterling turned on her. I do not care about your family. The words landed like a slap. I care about ownership. I care about delivery, and I care about whether I was induced to sign a $10 billion acquisition agreement based on statements that were false. Henry tried again. The patents are company assets. She wrote the code while working for us. Then produce the assignment agreement, Sterling said. Henry looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at the floor. Sterling saw all 3 answers without anyone speaking. He walked to the front of the room and took the black drive from Henry's hand with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. The escrow agent is being instructed not to release another dollar while my legal team reviews the closing conditions, he said. The transaction is now on hold. You will deliver the original source package and the documents proving your company owns the intellectual property. Marcus swallowed. How much time? Sterling checked his watch. 24 hours before my lawyers begin seeking every contractual remedy available to OmniTech. And if your representations about ownership were knowingly false, my counsel will make the appropriate fraud referrals. Chloe suddenly stopped smiling. What happens to the deposit? Sterling looked at her as though he had only just noticed she existed. Nothing moves until counsel determines what is legally releasable. Her hand tightened around the new Birkin. Henry's confidence finally cracked. I can get Nia. Marcus turned on him. You said you had the master drive. I thought I did. You thought... I watched her try to grab it. Vivian's face hardened. Then she tricked you. Henry stared at the dead diagnostic screen. She set me up. No, I had not forced him into my apartment. I had not ordered him to hire a locksmith. I had not told him to shove me onto a glass table and steal the first drive I pretended to protect. Henry had built the trap himself. I had simply made sure there was something waiting at the bottom. By the time Sterling walked out, OmniTech's legal team had already begun preserving logs from the failed handover. The black drive was sealed as evidence in the transaction dispute. The validation cluster was being rebuilt from a clean image. The $10 billion celebration had turned into an emergency legal review before most Atlanta executives had finished their first coffee. And my family had only one remaining option: find me. At exactly 11 that morning, someone began pounding on the door of my motel room. The heavy pounding on my motel room door shattered the morning silence. It was not the polite knock of housekeeping. It was the aggressive, entitled hammering of people who believed they owned whatever stood on the other side. I glanced at the digital clock on the cheap nightstand. It was exactly 11 in the morning. Sterling's handover demonstration at OmniTech headquarters had imploded hours ago. The stolen decoy drive had triggered exactly the isolated security response I expected. And now the panic had officially reached my door. I unlatched the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open. The humid Georgia air rushed into the room, followed immediately by the suffocating presence of my family. They had actually found me. My parents possessed extensive private resources, and between hired investigators, business contacts, and the community network they had cultivated for decades, they had traced me to the cheap motel faster than I expected. My mother Vivian stood in the center of the doorway, flanked by my father Marcus. But they had not come alone. They had brought the two kinds of authority they believed could still make me fold. Standing to my father's right was the senior pastor of our megachurch, a man whose moral influence my parents had cultivated through years of public generosity. To my mother's left stood the family lawyer holding a sleek leather briefcase. The message was obvious. If parental pressure failed, they intended to use religion and legal intimidation. They pushed their way into the tiny room without waiting for an invitation. The cramped space suddenly felt incredibly volatile. Their expensive designer clothing, their heavy gold jewelry, and my mother's overwhelming perfume clashed violently with the peeling wallpaper and the sharp smell of cheap industrial bleach. They looked utterly ridiculous standing in a roadside motel, but their desperation was palpable. Vivian did not waste a second. She stepped forward, her face twisted with panic and fury. You are an absolute disgrace to this family, Nia. Henry plugged that drive into OmniTech's validation system, and it wiped their entire demonstration environment. Sterling went ballistic. The $10 billion is still trapped in escrow, and his lawyers are threatening to terminate the deal and refer the transaction for investigation if we cannot produce the real source code. I crossed my arms, leaning back against the particle board desk. I am surprised Henry even knew which port to plug it into, I replied calmly. My mother took a threatening step forward, her eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. This is not a joke, she screamed. You are shaming our entire bloodline in front of a white billionaire. We are the crown jewel of Atlanta's elite. We represent decades of black excellence, and you are acting like a common street thug trying to extort us. You are making a mockery of everything we built. Before I could respond, the senior pastor placed a heavy hand on his gold cross necklace and stepped between us. He looked at me with deep, practiced disappointment, deploying the ultimate weapon of cultural guilt. Nia, my child, he said, his voice dropping into that familiar, soothing Sunday morning cadence. The Lord commands us to honor our mother and father. This rebellion of yours is tearing a pillar of our community apart. Your parents are respected leaders. They have provided jobs, they have built a legacy, and they have funded the sanctuary where you grew up. Do not let spite turn you away from grace and family. I stared at the pastor, my expression turning to stone. I wondered exactly how much money Marcus and Vivian had pledged to the new church expansion fund to get this man to drag himself to a rundown motel on a Monday morning just to manipulate me. I did not break eye contact with him. "Pastor," I said, my voice dead calm in the tiny room. "My parents dragged me out of a boardroom with private security, canceled every company card they controlled, and threw me into the street on Friday afternoon with nothing but the clothes on my back. Where exactly was your sermon about family love and God's grace when they were actively trying to ruin my life?" The pastor closed his mouth, his jaw tightening as he shifted uncomfortably and looked away, unable to maintain my gaze. He knew the truth, but the truth did not pay for his stained glass windows. My father stepped forward, his patience completely gone. His imposing figure seemed to take up all the remaining oxygen in the room. "Enough of this nonsense," Marcus barked, pointing a thick, heavy finger directly at my face. "We are not here to negotiate with a thief. You deliberately sabotaged company property. You stole the master code. Sterling has given us exactly 24 hours to produce the operational algorithm, or the merger is completely dead." Vivian reached into her quilted Chanel purse and pulled out a crisp certified cashier's check. She slammed it onto the cheap desk beside me. "I am going to give you $1 million, Vivian demanded, her tone shifting from rage to cold transaction. $1 million to hand over the real source code right now. You can take the money, start over somewhere else, and never speak to us again. If you refuse, our lawyer will file an emergency civil action claiming the code belongs to the company, seek an injunction ordering you to surrender it, and refer the sabotage allegations to law enforcement. You will spend years defending yourself while we close the deal." The family lawyer unlatched his expensive briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers meant to intimidate me. He told me the company considered the source code a proprietary trade secret and threatened an emergency civil action seeking possession of the files, an injunction, damages, and a referral to law enforcement if they believed I had taken company property. He urged me to accept Vivian's $1 million offer and surrender the code immediately. His tone was deliberately absolute, but the threat depended on one assumption: that the company actually owned the intellectual property. I looked down at the certified check resting on the desk. $1 million. They were offering me a pathetic fraction of a percent for the revolutionary technology I had built entirely from scratch. Technology they were currently trying to sell for $10 billion. They thought they could buy my life's work with pocket change and a few empty legal threats. They thought I was still the quiet, obedient girl who would cower when the family patriarch raised his voice. I let out a slow, genuine laugh that echoed off the thin motel walls. The sound of my laughter deeply unsettled them. Vivian's confident posture faltered, and Marcus dropped his pointing finger. They had expected me to cry. They had expected me to beg for forgiveness or nervously accept the check. They never expected absolute fearless amusement. I reached down into my canvas duffel bag sitting on the floor. My family tensed, clearly expecting me to pull out a silver flash drive containing the billion-dollar algorithm. Instead, I pulled out the thick manila folder I had retrieved from my hidden floor safe the night before. I bypassed my parents completely and stepped directly up to their aggressive corporate attorney. I opened the folder and pulled out a single stapled document. It was yellowed at the edges, but the ink was perfectly legible. I slid the document directly into the family lawyer's hands. "Sue me," I said, tilting my head and locking eyes with the family lawyer. "Before you file anything, you might want to read what my parents had me sign for the last 6 years' counsel." The family lawyer adjusted his glasses and took the single sheet of paper from my hand. He looked down with a dismissive smirk, fully expecting an amateur legal threat. But as his eyes moved through the definitions, ownership language, and missing assignment provisions, the smirk disappeared. A bead of sweat formed at his hairline. His hands began to tremble just enough for the paper to rustle in the quiet motel room. "What is that counsel?" my father demanded, taking a step toward the lawyer. "What did she give you?" Counsel swallowed hard and looked from my father to me and back to the paper. His legal training was finally doing what my parents had hired him to do: identify risk. The contracts in his hands were telling him that the family might have signed a $10 billion acquisition without a clean chain of title to the technology at the center of the deal. "I will save you the hourly billing rate and translate it for them." "Counsel," I said, pacing slowly across the worn carpet. For the last 6 years, my parents refused to put me on the official company payroll. They did not want the payroll taxes, health insurance costs, or matching retirement obligations associated with treating me like the central technical employee I actually was. They paid me on retainer as an independent contractor instead, keeping me outside the hierarchy while Henry enjoyed the title and the public credit. "You were paid handsomely for your work." Vivian snapped, her pearls clinking as her chest heaved with indignation. "We gave you a 6-figure retainer every year. You should be down on your knees thanking us." "A retainer," I countered, stepping right into her personal space. "That is the magic word, Mother. A retainer. You classified me as an independent contractor. I received a 1099 tax form every single January. I was never an employee of the robotics firm. I was a freelance vendor you hired to do the heavy lifting while Henry played golf." "So what?" Marcus bellowed, his voice rattling the cheap motel windows. "You worked for us. We paid you for the code. The company owns it. That is how business works." "No, Marcus, that is how you think business works," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Paying an independent contractor does not automatically give a company every intellectual property right the contractor creates. Ownership depends on the written agreements, the nature of the work, and any valid assignment. Your contracts never transferred my software rights. There is no invention assignment clause, no later patent assignment, and no document moving the registered core technology out of my LLC and into your company." I turned back to the trembling corporate lawyer. "Tell them, counsel. Tell my brilliant business mogul parents what they forgot to have me sign." Counsel wiped his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He could not look my father in the eye. "Marcus," he stammered, "she is right. There is no intellectual property assignment clause in this contract. It is a standard vendor agreement. I do not see any later instrument transferring her core software rights or patent ownership to the company." My father grabbed this paper out of the lawyer's hands and stared at the legal language as if it were written in another language. "What are you saying, counsel? Speak plainly." "I am saying the company cannot prove ownership of the artificial intelligence technology it promised OmniTech," the family lawyer replied, taking a panicked step backward. "The hardware patents and manufacturing assets belong to the company, but the core software rights and the patent filings Nia showed me are not assigned to the company under these agreements. That creates a fatal gap in the transaction unless she voluntarily licenses or transfers them." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the senior pastor seemed to understand the monumental gravity of the situation. My parents had built a $10 billion empire on a foundation of sand. They had marginalized me to save a few tax dollars, and in their supreme arrogance, they had left the front door to the vault wide open. "This is absurd," Vivian screamed, pointing an acrylic fingernail at the lawyer. "Fix this, counsel. Draw up whatever document you need right now, and we will make her sign it. We will force her to sign it." "It is too late for that, Vivian," I said, walking over to my canvas bag and zipping it shut. "On Friday afternoon, you and Marcus sat in that glass boardroom and signed a stack of merger and acquisition documents with OmniTech. You signed the representations and warranties. You legally guaranteed that your company possessed the rights necessary to deliver and operate the artificial intelligence technology covered by the transaction." I paused and let the weight of my words settle. "You represented to Sterling that your company owned and could deliver rights that your own contracts do not show you possess. If those representations were knowingly false and were transmitted to obtain release of the acquisition, Money Counsel can refer the conduct for possible wire fraud investigation. At a minimum, the closing representations are now in serious dispute, and the escrow cannot safely be treated as yours." My father lunged forward, his face twisted in a mask of pure violence. "I will break your neck, you ungrateful little," he roared, raising his heavy fist. Before he could take another step, the family lawyer grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him back. "Marcus, stop," he hissed. "Do not touch her. If you assault her, she can call the police, preserve the incident for court, and turn an already catastrophic ownership dispute into an even uglier case. We need to think about the legal exposure, not give her another claim. Legal exposure, Marcus spat, ripping his arm away from the lawyer. She is holding my $10 billion hostage. I am not going to let this disrespectful girl destroy my legacy. Your legacy is a fraud, Marcus, I said, staring him down without flinching. You built your reputation by standing on my shoulders. You let your church community praise you as a visionary, while you hid your brilliant daughter in the shadows, because she did not fit your aesthetic requirements for a perfect high society family. You wanted the credit without putting in the work. Now you are going to pay the price. The senior pastor stepped forward, raising his hands in a desperate gesture of peace. Nia, please let us not act in anger. We can mediate this. The church can facilitate a private settlement. Your parents can compensate you fairly. Do not invite the federal government into your family home. The scandal would ruin everything. The scandal is already happening, Pastor, I replied, grabbing my bag. OmniTech's isolated handover environment failed in front of Sterling this morning, and the buyer now knows my family cannot produce the source package they promised. There is no private church settlement that can erase the closing documents or the ownership problem. This is an intellectual property and acquisition dispute with enormous legal consequences, and I hold the rights they need. Vivian clutched her chest, suddenly struggling to breathe, as the reality of her impending social and financial ruin began to suffocate her. You cannot do this, Nia. She pleaded, her voice losing all its previous venom. We are your blood. If Sterling pulls out, we will be bankrupt. We leveraged the company assets to secure the loans for Henry's new estate. We will lose everything. The house, the cars, the country club memberships. That sounds like a personal cash flow problem, Vivian. Maybe Henry should get an entry-level data entry job to help pay the mortgage, I replied, tossing her own insults right back at her. The family lawyer, who had walked into the room intending to bully me into submission, now sounded far more careful. He asked whether there was a number that could resolve the ownership dispute and preserve the OmniTech transaction. My parents could restructure the deal, he said. They could assign me a major share of whatever proceeds were lawfully released. I told him I did not want a percentage of a transaction built on a false ownership representation. I wanted my rights recognized first. I walked past the lawyer, past the senior pastor, and past my stunned parents, stopping at the open door of the motel room. I do not want a percentage of a transaction built on ownership claims you cannot support, counsel. I will not negotiate away my rights under threat. I will see you all in court. I stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, leaving them trapped in that dingy room with the full weight of their own contractual negligence. As I walked toward the highway to reach the secure location arranged by my lawyers, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was not a message from counsel. It was an Instagram alert from the burner account I used to watch Chloe's public posts. I opened the notification. Chloe had just posted a new story to her public profile. The video showed her standing on the deck of a massive luxury yacht in Miami, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a bottle of expensive champagne. The caption read, "Securing the deposit. $10 billion lifestyle activated." I smiled and saved the public video to my evidence archive. My parents and their lawyer were sweating in a cheap motel over a transaction they could no longer prove they could close. Meanwhile, Henry and Chloe were spending company-controlled cash advanced against the expected merger proceeds and broadcasting the extravagance for the entire world to see. They were not spending Sterling's protected escrow directly, but they were creating a perfect record of how recklessly they treated corporate funds while the deal was under challenge. The trap was not just set. My family was actively pulling the trigger themselves. All I had to do now was set the stage for the grand finale, and there was no better place for a spectacular public execution than a high society gala. The soft blue glow of my tablet screen was the only source of light in the secure corporate hotel room I had relocated to later that afternoon. I sat with my knees pulled up to my chest, swiping through the digital evidence of my family's staggering hubris. Despite the catastrophic legal reality the family lawyer had laid out for them in that dingy motel room just hours earlier, my father Marcus and my brother Henry had apparently decided to double down on their own delusion. They had spent decades bullying, crushing, and outspending their competition in the Atlanta business world. In their arrogant minds, I was just a broke girl from the basement who lacked the financial stamina to endure a protracted legal battle. They genuinely believed I would run out of cash and crawl back to them begging for a fraction of the $1 million they had initially offered. They were fundamentally incapable of understanding that the Washington intellectual property firm had reviewed my contract's patent filings and the value of the disputed transaction before agreeing to represent me under an alternative fee arrangement. I did not need to produce a massive cash retainer on day one. The firm had enough confidence in the ownership record and enough at stake to structure fees around the litigation and any eventual recovery, while still making clear that no outcome in court was guaranteed. I tapped the screen and opened the latest string of Instagram stories uploaded by my sister-in-law. Chloe had abandoned any pretense of restraint. She was broadcasting her shopping spree to 50,000 followers, treating the expected OmniTech proceeds as if the closing were guaranteed and the family's company bridge funds were her own limitless checking account. Securing the bag, she sang into the camera, her perfectly glossed lips curled into a smug smile. When your husband closes the biggest tech deal of the decade, you do not settle for standard, you upgrade. The next story was a still photograph of a signed yacht purchase agreement resting on a glass table. Chloe had made sure the bold print was legible. Her manicured finger pointed toward a $5 million non-refundable deposit confirmation. The payment did not come out of Sterling's protected escrow account. That money was still under closing control. It came from a company-controlled bridge account Marcus had authorized against the family's expected merger proceeds. In other words, they were spending corporate liquidity as if the $10 billion closing were guaranteed, while the ownership dispute was already threatening the deal. My phone vibrated on the mattress beside me. It was a secure call from the senior managing partner of the Washington intellectual property firm. I put the call on speaker and answered. "Tell me you are watching the Miami broadcast," I said, my eyes tracking Chloe as she posted another video of herself clinking champagne glasses with a yacht broker. "Every single frame," the senior partner replied, professional amusement audible in his voice. His team was screen recording, archiving, and time-stamping Chloe's public posts. The $5 million yacht deposit would not automatically prove a crime, but it was powerful evidence for a motion to preserve disputed assets and for any later argument that the family was dissipating company funds while ownership of the merger's core asset was contested. I watched Chloe raise her glass of Dom Perignon to the camera. "This is for the haters," she slurred slightly, her face flushed with expensive alcohol and unearned victory. "When your toxic, jealous sister-in-law gets fired and tries to steal your family blessing, you just have to elevate. Keep crying in your cheap motel, Nia. We are busy making history." In the background of the video, Henry stumbled into the frame holding his own glass. He wrapped an arm around Chloe's waist and grinned sloppily at the lens. "The hardware is the real genius anyway," he boasted, leaning heavily against her. "Code is just typing. We own the metal." I paused the video right on Henry's flushed, arrogant face. The senior partner let out a sharp whistle over the phone line. "They are handing us evidence," he said. Henry's public statement separating the code from the hardware undercuts the story that the company unquestionably owns a single integrated product. Chloe's spending does not create a federal indictment by itself, but it gives us a clean record of asset dissipation and state of mind. We preserve it, we put it before the court, and we let investigators decide what criminal conclusions, if any, follow from the larger transaction. Why is Marcus letting them do this? I asked, genuinely curious about my father's psychological state. He is a ruthless narcissist, but he is usually protective of his capital. "Because Marcus is trying to pressure OmniTech's legal department," the senior partner explained. "OmniTech's general counsel circulated a formal notice to the lawyers on both sides about the ownership dispute and the failed Monday handover. Your father is publicly treating this as a minor human resources disagreement and demanding release of the remaining escrow. He is allowing Henry and Chloe to spend company money aggressively because he thinks confidence will force Sterling to keep the deal alive. He thinks he can fake it until he makes it," I murmured, shaking my head at the sheer stupidity of the strategy. "He does not realize Sterling only cares about a functional product, And right now, Sterling has a warehouse full of dead metal. Exactly, the senior partner agreed. OmniTech's general counsel has now confirmed in writing that the isolated demonstration environment failed and that the company received no usable source package. Sterling has given your family until Saturday night to produce the operational algorithm and valid ownership documentation. If they cannot, OmniTech intends to terminate or suspend the transaction under the closing terms, pursue civil fraud and contract remedies, and make whatever regulatory or criminal referrals its lawyers believe the evidence supports. Saturday night. I swiped back to my tablet. Chloe had just uploaded a brand new story. It was a meticulously styled photograph of a heavy gold embossed invitation card resting against her new crocodile skin handbag. I zoomed in on the elegant cursive text. You are cordially invited to the OmniTech and Vanguard Robotics merger gala this Saturday evening at the Ritz-Carlton, Atlanta. Join Marcus and Vivian as we celebrate a $10 billion legacy of Black excellence in technology. I stared at the invitation, my mind calculating the horrific trap my parents had just backed themselves into. They were throwing a massive high society gala to celebrate a deal that was currently on life support. They had invited the entire Atlanta elite, the press and the OmniTech executives, to the Ritz-Carlton. Marcus was planning to use the pressure of a public media event to force Sterling to smile for the cameras and accept whatever fabricated paperwork the family lawyer could throw together. It was a desperate high-stakes gamble built entirely on the assumption that I would stay hidden in the shadows. They are throwing a party, the senior partner noted after a short silence. A victory lap before the finish line. They want to trap Sterling in front of the press, I explained. My eyes locked on the gold lettering of the invitation. Marcus knows Sterling hates public scandals. He thinks if he fills a ballroom with journalists and local politicians, Sterling will be forced to shake his hand and keep the money flowing to avoid embarrassing his own brand. It is an ambush. The senior partner gave a dry chuckle that made me grateful he was on my side. Then we should make sure the actual rights holder attends. He told me the firm had prepared the verified ownership filings, requested emergency court protection against any transfer of my intellectual property, and assembled the evidence showing the family was spending company money while the dispute was active. I want to deliver the documents personally, I said, leaning forward in the dark room. I am not going to let them control the narrative. My mother spent her entire life using high society events to dictate reality. She told me I lacked the polish and the presentation for their new tax bracket. I want to show her exactly how much presentation I am capable of. I will have 2 of our litigators fly to Atlanta on Friday, the senior partner said. If the court grants the temporary restraining order we requested, they will carry certified service copies along with your patent records and ownership declarations. We will serve the corporate officers at the gala, preserve the transaction record in front of witnesses, and give OmniTech a lawful basis to keep the escrow from being released while the dispute is reviewed. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the mattress. I turned back to the tablet and watched Chloe's video one more time. She raised her glass of champagne, mocking my poverty, mocking my hard work, mocking my existence. Keep drinking, Chloe, I whispered to the empty room, the blue light reflecting in my cold, steady eyes. Enjoy the yacht. Enjoy the designer bags. Because by Saturday night you will not even be able to afford the valet parking. I powered down the tablet, plunging the room into total darkness. The chaotic, emotional wreckage of the past several days had completely vanished. I was no longer the discarded daughter mourning the loss of a family that never loved me. I was the architect, preparing to dismantle an empire. The final line of code had been written. The execution protocol was set. All I had to do now was dress for the occasion. The next morning, the heavy mahogany doors of my hotel suite swung open. 2 razor-sharp litigators from the Washington firm walked in carrying locked metal briefcases. They did not offer sympathetic smiles or ask how I was holding up. They were there to execute a high-stakes intellectual property strategy, and they immediately went to work. The lead litigator cleared the room service trays from the dining table and began laying out the legal package. It included the verified complaint, sworn ownership declarations, certified patent records, preservation demands, and the temporary restraining order. the federal court had issued to prevent transfer or use of the disputed intellectual property pending further hearing. I signed the documents that required my signature, each stroke of the pen severing another piece of my family's control over my work. The second litigator opened an encrypted laptop and turned the screen toward me. My father had gone into full damage control under the guise of an extravagant celebration. He had officially booked the grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton for Saturday night. The guest list was a who is who of Atlanta high society, with politicians, technology executives, influencers, and financial journalists, all invited to witness what Marcus wanted the world to believe was a completed $10 billion triumph. I stared at the screen, analyzing his strategy. He is using the community as a human shield, I realized aloud. He knows Sterling wants to pull the $10 billion. But if Sterling publicly walks away from a high-profile acquisition of a prominent African-American-owned tech firm without a rock-solid public reason, Marcus will spin the narrative. He will accuse OmniTech of systemic bias and bad faith business practices. Sterling hates bad press more than he hates losing money. Marcus is trying to trap him in a ballroom full of cameras to force the deal through. Exactly, the lead litigator agreed, tapping the table. OmniTech's general counsel copied our firm on a formal notice documenting Marcus's promise that he would deliver the complete intellectual property portfolio and core source code during the keynote handover tomorrow night. That notice matters because it fixes the representation in writing. If he presents fabricated ownership papers after receiving our claim, the record of knowledge becomes much harder for him to explain away. Henry is going to mock up some old system architecture schematics and slap a confidential sticker on it, I said, shaking my head at the sheer audacity of my brother. They actually think Sterling is stupid enough to accept a prop just to save face at a party. The senior partner's voice echoed from the speakerphone in the center of the table. Let them try. If Marcus knowingly presents fabricated ownership documents to secure release of a $10 billion transaction, the conduct could support far more than a contract claim. We will preserve the electronic communications and refer the record to the appropriate authorities. Your job is simpler, Nia. Walk and establish ownership, and let their own signatures do the rest. The plan was flawless. My parents had spent my entire life silencing me, telling me to stay in the background because I did not fit their polished elite aesthetic. They wanted to use this gala to cement their fake legacy. I was going to use it to publicly dismantle it. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from my mother. The sheer desperation must have finally pierced through her arrogance because she had bypassed her lawyers to contact me directly. I opened the message. Nia, we can still handle this privately. Your brother has worked too hard for this moment. Do not ruin his night out of spite. I left a cashier's check for $50,000 with the concierge at your last known motel. Take it. Leave Atlanta. Start over somewhere else. We will not press charges for your sabotage if you just walk away right now. $50,000. She was offering me the equivalent of one of Chloe's handbags to disappear from a $10 billion ownership dispute. I did not reply. I handed the phone to the second litigator and told her to preserve the message with the rest of the case file. It was relevant evidence that Vivian was trying to pressure me to abandon my claim while the transaction was under review. Whether a court treated it as settlement pressure, bad faith, or something more serious would be for counsel and the judge to decide. The second litigator gave a thin professional smile and immediately archived the message with its metadata. I needed armor for Saturday night. I was not going to walk into the Ritz-Carlton looking like the defeated outcast they expected. I contacted a bespoke tailor in the city who catered to high-powered executives. I requested an emergency fitting. I did not want a ball gown or an extravagant cocktail dress. I wanted power. I selected a razor-sharp tailored suit in a deep striking crimson. It was bold, unapologetic, and commanded absolute authority. While Chloe was likely squeezing herself into a diamond-encrusted dress paid for with company bridge money, advanced against an escrow closing that had never occurred, I was wrapping myself in pure executive dominance. Saturday morning arrived with a suffocating tension hanging over the city. I spent the day going over the timeline with my legal team. Every detail had to be executed with surgical precision. Sterling would arrive at the Ritz-Carlton at 8 in the evening. The press would be allowed into the grand ballroom at 9. Marcus was scheduled to give his victory speech and conduct the ceremonial handover at exactly 9:30. "We move at 9:25, the lead litigator said, checking his watch. "The Ritz-Carlton is a private venue, so we are not treating a court order like a magic invitation. Our firm has already notified hotel management and counsel that named corporate officers inside must be served with the temporary restraining order. Management has confirmed a controlled route for service. We walk in, present the certified papers, and stay within the scope of the order." I sat in the plush chair of my hotel suite, watching the news coverage on the television. Local channels were already hyping up the merger gala, celebrating my parents as pioneers of tech innovation. They showed B-roll footage of Henry stepping out of a sports car waving to cameras. He looked so incredibly smug, completely unaware that the sword was already swinging down toward his neck. My parents believed they had successfully outmaneuvered everyone. They thought their money, their influence, and their shiny white sister-in-law would protect them from the consequences of their profound incompetence. They had built an entire empire on a foundation of lies, and they had used my brilliant mind as the mortar to hold it all together. The sun slowly dipped below the Atlanta skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the city. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my suite and adjusted the lapels of my crimson suit. My hair was pulled back sharp and sleek. My makeup was flawless. There was no trace of the quiet, terrified girl who used to hide in the basement servers. I looked like a billionaire. I looked like the owner of the most advanced artificial intelligence algorithm on the planet. The two Washington litigators stood by the door holding locked metal briefcases containing certified patent records, ownership declarations, and service copies of the court's temporary restraining order. "It is time," the second litigator said, her voice low and steady. I picked up my phone, taking one last look at a notification from Chloe's Instagram. She had posted a picture of the grand ballroom dripping in crystal and white roses with the caption, "Victory tastes like champagne." I locked the screen and slipped the phone into my pocket. I turned to my legal team. "Let us go crash a party," I said. The heavy brass doors of the Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom stood like a gilded fortress shielding the greatest financial fraud in Atlanta history. Inside the cavernous space, crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant golden glow over a sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. My parents had pulled out all the stops for their victory lap. The room was packed with the absolute upper echelon of the city. Tech executives, prominent politicians, and the most influential figures of the African-American elite mingled over $1,000 bottles of champagne. Waiters in pristine white coats circulated with silver trays of caviar, while a live jazz band played smoothly in the corner. It was a flawless picture of wealth, power, and success. And it was all built on a massive lie. Near the center of the room, surrounded by a halo of popping camera flashes, my brother Henry was holding court. I watched him through the narrow glass panels of the ballroom doors. He was wearing a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, looking every bit the visionary leader my parents had spent years pretending he was. A journalist from Forbes magazine had her recording device thrust toward him, hanging on his every word. "Our vision for the future of artificial intelligence is about intuitive synergy," Henry boasted, flashing his perfectly veneered smile for the cameras. "We did not just build a machine. We built a dynamic learning ecosystem. The hardware and the software are one cohesive mind." When OmniTech approached us, I knew Sterling shared my personal philosophy on automated evolution. It is about pushing the boundaries of what is possible. He strung together a bunch of meaningless corporate buzzwords he had memorized from a public relations briefing. He sounded incredibly confident for a man who could not even code a basic calculator. I stood in the marble foyer just outside the ballroom, taking a slow, deliberate breath. My two Washington litigators stood firmly on either side of me, their metal briefcases gripped tightly in their hands. They were stone-faced and focused. I looked down at my feet. The sharp-pointed toes of my crimson Christian Louboutin heels rested against the polished marble floor. These shoes were not made for standing in the shadows. They were made for walking directly into the room where my family had decided I did not belong. "Open the doors," I commanded. The second litigator reached forward and pushed the heavy brass handles. The doors swung open wide, cutting through the smooth jazz music and drawing every eye toward the entrance. I stepped into the grand ballroom. The sharp, rhythmic click of my red heels against the marble entryway commanded instant attention. I did not sneak in. I marched forward with the absolute authority of a queen reclaiming her stolen throne. The vibrant crimson of my tailored power suit cut through the sea of safe black tuxedos and muted evening gowns, like a drop of fresh blood in a glass of water. Conversations nearest the entrance instantly died. People turned holding their champagne flutes in midair, their eyes widening as they recognized the exiled daughter of the Marcus family. The whispers started immediately rippling through the crowd like a shockwave. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead. I did not look at the local politicians or the gossip-hungry socialites. My eyes were locked entirely on the elevated main stage at the front of the room, where a massive digital screen displayed the logos of our family company and OmniTech intertwined. Suddenly, a harsh, screeching voice shattered the mounting tension. "Security! Where is security?" Chloe came shoving her way through a group of stunned investors, her face twisted into panic and rage. She had squeezed herself into a glittering silver haute couture gown that cost more than my first college tuition. A massive diamond necklace rested heavily against her collarbone. Another recent purchase made while she and Henry were spending company money in anticipation of an escrow release that had never actually occurred. "What the hell are you doing here?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill enough to make several journalists turn their cameras toward us. "You are not on the guest list. You do not belong here. Someone get the guards right now. Throw this beggar out onto the street. She is trespassing." I did not stop walking. I did not even break my stride. I kept moving forward, forcing Chloe to stumble backward in her high heels to avoid being run over by my sheer momentum. 4 hotel security guards in dark suits rushed over, responding to the frantic screaming of the chief executive officer's wife. They moved to form a physical barricade between me and the center of the ballroom, reaching out to grab my arms just as they had done in the corporate boardroom 2 days ago. "Do not touch her," Chloe ordered the guards, her face flushed with tyrannical entitlement. "Grab her and physically throw her out the back service doors. She is a disgruntled former employee trying to ruin a private corporate event." I did not even blink. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I simply stopped and let my legal team do exactly what I paid them to do. The lead litigator stepped cleanly in front of me before the nearest hotel guard could touch my arm. He opened his metal briefcase and produced a certified copy of the court order together with the hotel's written acknowledgement of the service arrangement. He held the papers where the head of security could read the case caption and the names of the corporate officers inside. "I represent the owner of the intellectual property at issue in tonight's transaction," the lead litigator said, his voice carrying clearly to the surrounding crowd. "This is a certified temporary restraining order from the United States District Court, preserving the disputed technology and prohibiting its transfer or use pending further hearing. We are here to serve the named corporate officers. Your management and counsel have already confirmed access for that limited purpose. We are not asking you to decide the case. We are asking you not to interfere with lawful service." The head of security, read the case caption, glanced at the written authorization from hotel management and spoke briefly into his radio. After receiving confirmation, he ordered the guards to step aside. They were there to manage a private event, not to obstruct service of a court order their own legal department had already reviewed. Chloe stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing in absolute shock. The power she thought she wielded as the white wife of an elite black tech founder had just been completely neutralized by a single piece of paper. She looked around wildly expecting anyone to step in and protect her stolen wealth. "You cannot do this," Chloe stammered, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. "Marcus is about to take the stage. Sterling is right there in the front row. You are ruining everything." I finally looked directly at my sister-in-law. I stepped so close to her I could smell the expensive champagne on her breath. I looked down at the massive diamond necklace resting against her chest. "Enjoy the jewelry, Chloe," I said, my voice icy and calm. "You may want to keep the receipt close. Your own public posts have already made that necklace, the yacht deposit, and every other recent luxury purchase part of the asset dissipation record my lawyers preserved for the court." Chloe's face drained of all color, turning an ashen, sickly white. She stumbled backward, her hands flying up to clutch her diamond necklace as if trying to protect it from vanishing into thin air. I turned away from her, completely dismissing her existence. The crowd of elites, journalists, and tech executives naturally parted like the Red Sea, allowing me a clear, unobstructed path straight down the center aisle. The whispers had turned into a deafening roar of speculation. Camera flashes began to erupt blindingly bright as reporters realized they were about to witness the corporate execution of the decade. At the very front of the room, standing near the edge of the stage, my father Marcus and my mother Vivian had finally noticed the commotion. Marcus was holding a silver briefcase, which supposedly contained the physical handover documents for Sterling. Vivian was holding a crystal glass, her perfect high society smile completely frozen on her face as she watched her exiled daughter march toward them, bathed in the glow of 100 camera flashes. They had tried to bury me in the dark, but they forgot that pressure only creates diamonds. And tonight I was bringing the hammer down. I reached the base of the carpeted stairs leading up to the main stage. The sheer kinetic energy of the room had ground to an absolute halt. The live jazz band stopped playing mid-note, creating a suffocating vacuum of silence across the grand ballroom. My father Marcus instinctively stepped in front of the podium, his large frame attempting to physically block my ascent. He gripped the silver briefcase so tightly, his knuckles turned a mottled gray. "You take one more step and I will have you arrested," Marcus hissed, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper intended only for me. "You are destroying your own blood." My lead Washington litigator stepped smoothly between us before Marcus could close the distance. "Do not touch my client," he said. "We are here under a court-approved service arrangement. If you assault her, hotel security and local police can deal with that separately." Marcus froze, his eyes darting toward Sterling as if the billionaire might still rescue him. I ascended the stairs and walked straight toward the center podium. My brother Henry stood frozen behind the microphone stand, sweating profusely in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. He tried to force a confident laugh, attempting to play off the interruption for the hundreds of journalists and elite guests staring up at us. "Well, folks, it looks like we have a surprise guest," Henry stammered, tapping the microphone nervously. "My little sister Nia, everyone. She always did love making an entrance." I did not even look at him. I stepped up to the podium, reached out, and ripped the microphone straight out of his trembling hands. A sharp burst of audio feedback screeched through the ballroom, making several high society guests wince and cover their ears. I stood dead center under the glaring stage lights, projecting absolute dominance. I raised my left hand and gave a sharp, definitive signal to the audiovisual booth at the back of the room. My second litigator had already coordinated with hotel management and the event's technical team, so the certified ownership document could be displayed once service was completed. The massive LED screen behind me, which had proudly displayed the intertwined logos of our family company and OmniTech, suddenly went black. A second later, a brilliant, stark white document flashed across the 60-foot digital display. It was not a corporate schematic or a marketing presentation. It was a certified legal document bearing the unmistakable gold seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The sudden shift in lighting cast a harsh, unforgiving glare over my parents' faces. "Good evening, Atlanta," I said, my voice resonating deeply through the state-of-the-art sound system echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "And good evening to the press, the investors, and specifically to Mr. Sterling." I looked directly down at the ruthless tech billionaire sitting in the front row. Sterling had stopped breathing. His cold gray eyes were locked onto the massive screen behind me, his razor-sharp business instincts already calculating the catastrophic disaster unfolding before him. In high-stakes mergers and acquisitions, there is a standard contractual clause known as representations and warranties. I continued pacing the stage, slowly commanding the space with every step of my crimson heels. The sellers must legally guarantee that they hold clear, unencumbered ownership of the intellectual property they are selling. Yesterday morning, my parents and my brother, the supposed chief executive officer standing beside me, signed those very documents. They swore to a $10 billion buyer that they owned the artificial intelligence algorithm powering Vanguard Robotics. A loud, frantic murmur rippled through the crowd. Financial journalists from the Wall Street Journal and Forbes magazine scrambled to pull out their digital recorders and smartphones, capturing every single word. I turned and pointed sharply at the massive LED screen. If anyone in the press corps has a zoom lens, I highly suggest you focus it on the screen behind me right now. That is a federally registered patent for the neural network architecture and the dynamic machine learning algorithms that make those robots function. Take a very close look at the ownership entity. It does not belong to my parents' corporation. It does not belong to Henry. It belongs to an independent limited liability company entirely registered to me. "Turn that off!" Marcus roared, abandoning his silver briefcase on the stage floor. He frantically waved his arms at the technical booth, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Turn off the screen right now. This is a private corporate event." Nobody in the technical booth moved. The second litigator stood beside the control area with a certified copy of the temporary restraining order and the display file that had been provided to hotel management as part of the service plan. "For 6 years, my parents refused to make me an official employee of this company," I announced, projecting my voice over my father's frantic shouting. "They wanted to dodge corporate payroll taxes to fund my brother's luxury sports cars and my sister-in-law's endless designer shopping sprees. They classified me as an independent freelance contractor. And in their supreme, staggering arrogance, they never asked me to sign an intellectual property assignment agreement." The collective gasp from the elite crowd was audible. Corporate executives in the audience began whispering furiously to one another, instantly recognizing the catastrophic legal loophole I had just exposed. "The family company does not own the core technology it promised OmniTech," I explained, keeping my tone razor-sharp and precise. "My contractor agreements never assigned the software rights. The later patent filings identify my LLC as the owner, and there is no executed instrument transferring those rights to Marcus's company. My family owns the factory's chassis and hardware it actually developed. It does not own the legal rights to the algorithm that makes those machines function." I turned slowly and locked eyes with my mother. Vivian stood paralyzed near the edge of the stage, her perfect posture completely shattered. Her diamond necklace sparkled under the lights, but her face was the color of dirty ash. She had told me family was business, and I had no commercial value. I wanted her to feel the exact moment her entire high society legacy burned to the ground. "So, Mr. Sterling," I said, turning my attention back to the billionaire in the front row, "you did not just buy the future of robotics. You bought a fleet of empty, useless metal shells. My family sold you a product they do not legally own. In the corporate world, executing a $10 billion transaction with fraudulent ownership claims is not a simple contractual error or a minor human resources dispute." I paused, letting the absolute silence of the grand ballroom amplify the weight of my next words. If those ownership representations were knowingly false and transmitted to move a $10 billion transaction, the record supports a referral for potential federal wire fraud. The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Chloe, still frozen in the center aisle, let out a terrified sob and clutched the massive diamond necklace at her throat. She finally understood that the money she had been spending was not an untouchable family blessing. It was company cash now sitting inside a documented ownership dispute, and lawyers, banks, and potentially investigators would be tracing where it went. Henry stood trembling at the edge of the podium, his perfectly styled hair now matted with cold sweat. He looked like a little boy who had just been caught stealing from the collection plate. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but no words came out. His entire fake identity as a visionary tech genius had been publicly butchered in less than 3 minutes. "The algorithm is mine," I declared, my voice ringing with finality. "The technology is mine, and this entire merger is now the center of a $10 billion fraud dispute." I held the microphone out in front of me, maintaining direct eye contact with my utterly destroyed family. Then I opened my hand. The heavy metal microphone dropped. It hit the polished wooden stage with a violent, definitive thud that echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. The feedback squealed one final time, signaling the absolute end of the Marcus family empire. I did not look back. I turned on my crimson heels and prepared to watch the billionaire's wrath consume everything they loved. For a fraction of a second after the microphone hit the stage, nobody moved. Then the front row erupted. Sterling shot up from his seat, knocking his chair backward. He bypassed the velvet ropes and marched straight up the steps to the stage, his face set in absolute fury. My father, Marcus, stepped back, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Sterling, please," Marcus stammered, his booming church voice reduced to a frantic, high-pitched wheeze. "This is just a minor internal dispute, a simple paperwork error. I can have my lawyers fix this right now." Sterling ignored him completely. He bent down, snatched the discarded microphone off the polished wood floor and turned it back on. The sharp screech of audio feedback pierced the air again, but Sterling did not flinch. He stepped right into my father's personal space, backing Marcus against the giant LED screen that still proudly displayed my indisputable patent ownership. "A paperwork error." Sterling repeated, his voice amplified and vibrating with a rage so pure it made the front row of investors physically recoil. "You sat in my boardroom, Marcus. You looked me in the eye and you signed a legally binding representation that you owned the proprietary technology to Vanguard Robotics. You guaranteed it." "Sterling, we can mediate this," my father begged, sweat pouring down his forehead, ruining his custom-tailored suit. "She is my daughter. We will bring her into the fold. The technology stays with the company. She just proved you cannot deliver the technology rights you warranted to me." Sterling roared, the last of his professional restraint snapping. "The $10 billion is still in escrow. My counsel is instructing the escrow agent to stop any release while we invoke the transaction's dispute provisions and seek every available civil remedy. We will sue for breach, fraud, and misrepresentation, and if the evidence shows deliberate electronic deception, our lawyers will refer it to the appropriate federal authorities. I will not let you turn my company into the victim of your family's accounting fantasy." The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Journalists were practically climbing over each other to get a clear shot of the OmniTech founder publicly eviscerating the patriarch of Atlanta high society. Camera flashes strobed like lightning, illuminating the sheer terror on my family members' faces. Henry suddenly snapped. The facade of the confident visionary CEO completely evaporated, revealing the panicked, cowardly boy underneath. He spun around and pointed a trembling finger directly at my mother. "This is your fault," Henry screamed at Vivian, completely ignoring the hundreds of cameras capturing his breakdown. "You told me the contracts were ironclad. You said Nia was just a freelance vendor and we did not need her signature. You handled the human resources paperwork." Vivian gasped, clutching her pearl necklace as if it were suddenly strangling her. "Keep your voice down, Henry," she hissed, her eyes darting frantically toward the press corps. "Do not do this in front of the cameras. We need to present a united front." "A united front?" Henry shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically. "I am the one listed as chief executive officer on the merger documents. If federal investigators decide those representations were knowingly false, they are going to start with my signature. You just handed me years of legal exposure because you wanted to save money on payroll." Down in the center aisle, Chloe finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of the situation. The champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble floor. She grabbed her hair, ruining her expensive blowout, her breathing turning into rapid, shallow gasps. "The deposit," Chloe hyperventilated, her eyes wide with a terror so deep it looked like she had seen a ghost. "The $5 million deposit. Henry, the yacht brokers in Miami, already processed the wire transfer. I signed the non-refundable contract." Henry stared at his wife, his face draining of whatever color it had left. "You committed us to a $5 million yacht deposit using company bridge money while the closing was under dispute. You told me the deal was closed." Chloe screamed, tears ruining her makeup. "You told me we were billionaires. If the escrow never releases, the yacht broker is going to enforce the contract, and the lawyers are going to trace every dollar we spent. We are ruined. You ruined us." Chloe, Henry fired back, shoving past his mother to yell at his wife. "You just had to have the boat right now. You could not wait until Monday." I stood near the edge of the stage, watching my entire family turn on each other like starving animals in a cage. There was no loyalty. There was no black excellence. There was no family bond. The moment the money evaporated, their true nature was exposed for the entire world to see. They were greedy, incompetent frauds, and they were tearing each other apart right in front of the people they spent their whole lives trying to impress. My lead litigator stepped up beside me, his metal briefcase securely locked and his posture perfectly relaxed. "The order has been served," he said over the screaming and camera shutters. "OmniTech has acknowledged the ownership dispute on the record, and the escrow remains subject to the transaction hold and court protections. Our job here is done, Nia." I nodded, smoothing down the lapel of my crimson suit. I looked one last time at my parents. Marcus was currently trying to physically block a Forbes photographer from taking pictures of Vivian, who had collapsed into a chair, hyperventilating into her hands. Henry and Chloe were screaming at each other over the shattered champagne glass, their high society marriage dissolving into a brutal legal liability. They did not look like titans of industry anymore. They looked exactly like what they were, people whose own signatures and greed had finally caught up with them. "Let us go," I told my legal team. I turned and began my descent down the carpeted stairs of the stage. The crowd of elite guests, tech investors, and politicians immediately parted, forming a wide, clear path for me. Nobody dared to speak to me. Nobody dared to block my way. They looked at me with a mixture of absolute shock and profound respect. I was no longer the invisible sister hiding in the basement. I was the woman who just brought down a $10 billion fraudulent empire with a single piece of paper. As I walked down the center aisle, my sharp crimson heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, Chloe lunged forward. She broke away from Henry and tried to grab my arm, her face streaked with black mascara, her expensive silver gown completely rumpled. "Nia, please," Chloe begged, her voice collapsing into a desperate whine. "You have to fix this. Tell Sterling it was a misunderstanding. Give them the code. If the court process and investigators trace the company transfers, they will see the yacht deposit and everything else we spent. I will lose everything. Please, you cannot do this to family." The lead litigator instantly stepped between us, blocking Chloe from making physical contact. I stopped and looked at my sister-in-law. The massive diamond necklace at her throat was the same kind of trophy she had used for days to announce that the $10 billion deal already belonged to her. "I warned you, Chloe," I said, my voice low, smooth, and utterly devoid of pity. "I told you to keep the receipt." I stepped around her and walked straight through the heavy brass doors of the Ritz-Carlton into the cool Atlanta night. The valet brought the waiting car around. I slid into the back seat and the two Washington litigators took their places beside me. As the car pulled away from the curb, I looked out the tinted window at the glowing facade of the luxury hotel. Inside that building, the legacy my parents cared about more than their own daughter was burning to ash. They had tried to sell my mind to buy their status. Now they had absolutely nothing. The war was over. I had won. But the true business negotiations were only just beginning. I sit here now on my emerald green velvet sofa, looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline from the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new penthouse. The city lights reflect in my glass of red wine, but the vintage tastes much sweeter tonight. A genuine deep sigh of relief leaves my chest, and for the first time in my entire life, I can simply smile. The chaotic storm I unleashed that night at the Ritz-Carlton did not just damage my family's empire. It absolutely obliterated it, leaving nothing but scorched earth in its wake. By Monday morning, Sterling proved he was a man of his word and a terrifying opponent to make. OmniTech filed a sweeping civil action against Marcus Vivian Henry and the family company for breach of contract, fraud, and misrepresentation, while its lawyers referred the electronic transaction record to the appropriate authorities for independent review. The court entered temporary restraints over the disputed transaction proceeds and specifically identified assets tied to the alleged dissipation, while the escrow agent continued to hold the $10 billion purchase money. The family was not magically stripped of every lawful dollar overnight, but the liquid wealth supporting their public image was suddenly trapped behind litigation liens and emergency preservation orders. The social fallout was brutal, immediate, and completely merciless. In the affluent circles of Black Atlanta, high society reputation was currency, and my parents had just bankrupted theirs. Their memberships and board positions came under review as financial outlets reported the failed acquisition, the ownership dispute, and OmniTech's lawsuit. Invitations disappeared. Calls stopped being returned. The people who had celebrated Marcus and Vivian as symbols of flawless success suddenly treated them like a liability nobody wanted photographed beside. But the most poetic social consequence came from the church. The senior pastor who had stood in my cheap motel room and tried to use faith to pressure me publicly distanced the congregation from Marcus and Vivian once the scandal became impossible to ignore. He preached about greed and deception without mentioning how eagerly he had tried to mediate the dispute in my parents' favor. The hypocrisy did not surprise me. What mattered was that the social institution my parents had used as a shield no longer protected them. Yet the most frightening consequence for Henry came from the legal investigation. His signature was on the merger documents representing that the company owned and could deliver the core intellectual property. Prosecutors and financial investigators began reviewing whether those statements, the electronic communications surrounding the escrow, and the later spending supported criminal charges. No sentence was automatic, and no one could lawfully promise the outcome before charges trial or plea proceedings. But if Henry were charged and convicted of serious federal fraud offenses, years of imprisonment and substantial restitution were realistic possibilities. Chloe, the opportunistic sister-in-law who had mocked me and flaunted her stolen wealth, saw the writing on the wall faster than any of them. She had married Henry for money status and limitless access. Serious federal exposure, collapsing company value, and assets tied up in litigation were not part of her long-term plans. While Henry locked himself in his home office trying to reach defense lawyers, Chloe began planning her exit. Chloe saw the litigation closing around Henry and moved with the ruthless efficiency of someone determined to save herself first. Before any court order specifically reached the remaining jewelry and cash in her possession, she packed 3 designer suitcases with personal items gathered, what physical cash she could lawfully access, and separated herself from Henry. She tried to move additional funds, but the banks were already flagging unusual transfers tied to the disputed transaction. Her attempt only created more records for the lawyers to preserve. Then she filed for divorce and disappeared from the house, leaving Henry to face the consequences alone. She did not even have the decency to say goodbye in person. She simply left a pristine manila folder containing expedited divorce papers on the kitchen island, right next to the bank's final foreclosure notice. When federal investigators and process servers arrived at Henry's estate later that week, with subpoenas, preservation demands, and court papers connected to the investigation, they found the supposed visionary tech founder curled on the hardwood floor crying into his hands. The bank had already posted default and foreclosure notices at the property because the family's financing structure was unraveling, but nobody had illegally padlocked an occupied home. Chloe was gone. The rooms that had once displayed their new wealth looked stripped and hollow, and Henry finally understood that the legal process would continue whether my parents could save him or not. My brother was finally facing the real world without my brain to protect him, and the sheer terror of his reality was tearing him to pieces. He had no code, no company, no wife, and no future. Marcus and Vivian were equally paralyzed, trapped in their own crumbling mansion, waiting for the knock on the door that would end their freedom. The house of cards they had built using my blood and sweat had completely collapsed under the weight of their own towering arrogance. They had tried to sell my mind, but in the end they had only managed to sell their own souls. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my newly leased temporary office space in Midtown Atlanta. The light was brilliant and blinding, a stark contrast to the windowless basement my parents had confined me to for over half a decade. I stood near the glass watching the morning traffic flow far below. The coffee in my hand was black and strong. The digital clock on my desk read exactly 8 in the morning. I knew he was coming. A man who loses $10 billion on a Friday does not wait until Monday to find the person who can fix his balance sheet. Right on schedule, the heavy frosted glass doors of my office swung open. Sterling walked in alone. There were no aggressive corporate lawyers flanking him, no public relations managers hovering nervously nearby. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his expression an unreadable mask of pure predatory calculation. He did not look angry anymore. The explosive rage he had unleashed on my father at the Ritz-Carlton had been entirely replaced by cold analytical business acumen. Sterling was a survivor. He recognized that anger was a liability when sitting across from the person holding the only asset he desperately needed. He paused in the center of the room, taking in my sparse but highly functional setup. Rows of encrypted servers hummed quietly in the corner, processing massive data sets. He looked at me, his gray eyes assessing my posture, my confidence, the tailored crimson suit I had worn to the gala, which I had swapped today for a sleek white executive dress. "You destroyed a $10 billion merger in less than 3 minutes," Sterling said, his voice smooth and echoing slightly in the large open space. "You humiliated the most prominent high society family in Atlanta. You triggered a federal investigation, and you sent my own legal department into a tailspin that lasted all weekend." "I did not sabotage a legitimate business deal," I replied, setting my coffee mug down on the pristine white desk. "I exposed a $10 billion transaction built on ownership representations my family could not support. They tried to sell you a vehicle while I held the title to the engine. I saved OmniTech from years of litigation, technical failure, and shareholder chaos. You should be thanking me." Sterling let out a low, sharp laugh. It was a genuine sound, completely devoid of the fake corporate charm my brother Henry used to deploy. Sterling walked over to the guest chair across from my desk and sat down, crossing his legs. He rested his hands on his knees. "Your brother was an absolute idiot," Sterling stated flatly. "He sat in my boardroom for 6 months, using buzzwords he clearly memorized from online articles. He promised me revolutionary machine learning algorithms, but he could not answer a single technical question about neural network latency or predictive modeling without checking his phone. I knew he was a fraud, Nia. I knew Marcus and Vivian were just smooth-talking salespeople selling an image. But the hardware was solid, and the test data we received was light years ahead of anything my internal engineering team had developed. I wanted the technology. I did not care who actually wrote it. Until you realized you were buying it from the wrong person," I countered, pulling out my leather chair and sitting directly across from him. "My parents kept me locked in the dark because they knew if you met the real architect, you would cut them out of the equation entirely. They told me I had no commercial value. They told me I lacked the polish to sit at the adults' table." Sterling leaned forward, his eyes locked onto mine. "They were fundamentally wrong. You are the most dangerous person I have ever met in business, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment." He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek silver folder. He slid it across the smooth surface of my desk. "I want the algorithm, Nia. I want the core source code, the encryption keys, the patent transfers, and your ongoing expertise. I have a fleet of 50,000 robotic chassis sitting in a manufacturing facility in Texas right now. Without your artificial intelligence architecture, they are just oversized paperweights. My board of directors is demanding blood. I need to close this loop today. I am offering you $3 billion cash for the complete and total transfer of your intellectual property. You sign this, and you become one of the wealthiest women in America before lunch." I looked down at the silver folder. $3 billion was an astronomical sum of money. It was enough to buy private island sports franchises and generational security. It was the kind of money that made people lose their minds. But I did not even reach for the folder. I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap. "I am not selling you the patents, Sterling," I said, my voice calm and unwavering. Sterling narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening slightly. He was not used to hearing the word no. "Do not overplay your hand, Nia. You have leverage, but you also have a single asset. $3 billion is an extremely generous valuation for a standalone algorithm." "It is a generous valuation for a stagnant product," I corrected him. "But my algorithm is a dynamic learning ecosystem. It evolves. The machine learning model I built increases its processing efficiency by 2% every single month it remains active. In 5 years, it will not just run robotics. It will run global logistics networks, automated medical surgical tools, and deep space exploration vehicles. If I sell you the patent outright, I cap my own value. I refuse to put a ceiling on my own genius. I stood up, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, and looked down at the city. My parents tried to own me. They tried to claim my hard work as their own family legacy. I am never giving up ownership of my mind again. Not to my father, and certainly not to you. Sterling turned in his chair, watching me carefully. Then what exactly is your counteroffer? I turned to face the billionaire. Licensing, I stated firmly. An exclusive perpetual licensing agreement. You get full access to the source code to power OmniTech's robotics division. You get exclusive commercial rights to implement the current architecture across all your global platforms. But the core patents remain registered to my limited liability company. I retain absolute ownership. And the cost? Sterling asked, his tone shifting into pure calculation. $5 billion in liquid cash wired directly into my personal accounts by close of business today, I declared. And a 10% equity stake in OmniTech itself. I want a seat on your board of directors. I will not just be a vendor. I will be a major shareholder in your empire. Sterling stared at me in stunned silence. $5 billion in cash and 10% equity was an unprecedented demand. It was a hostile takeover masked as a vendor agreement. He stood up, pacing the length of my office, his mind processing the math, the market valuation, and the sheer audacity of my terms. You are asking for a kingdom, Nia, he murmured, stopping right in front of my desk. I am offering you the keys to the universe, Sterling, I shot back without missing a beat. My code is the only thing standing between you and a catastrophic shareholder revolt. If you walk out that door, I will license the technology to your biggest competitor in Silicon Valley tomorrow morning. They will dominate the global market, and OmniTech will be completely obsolete in 24 months. You know I am right. Sterling looked at me, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. He extended his right hand across the desk. Draw up the paperwork, he commanded. Welcome to the board of directors, Nia. The negotiation moved quickly, but a $5 billion license and a 10% equity stake still required board approval, definitive documents, compliance review, and closing mechanics. Sterling and I signed a binding term sheet that morning. Over the following days, OmniTech's board approved the structure. The licensing agreement was finalized, and the cash consideration settled through normal wire and verification procedures. When the closing completed, I retained ownership of the core patents through my LLC OmniTech, received the exclusive commercial license promised in the deal, and I became a 10% shareholder with a board seat. I did not buy yachts or diamond necklaces like Chloe. I did not purchase a fleet of sports cars like Henry. I used my unprecedented new wealth to build a fortress of innovation. Within exactly 30 days, I purchased a sprawling state-of-the-art campus in the heart of Atlanta. I officially founded the NIA Data Research Institute. I built recruiting programs designed to widen access to engineers who were routinely overlooked by traditional technology networks, with particular success attracting brilliant Black women and other underrepresented specialists. Every hire still had to meet the same brutal technical standards. The difference was that nobody was dismissed because they lacked the right family name, social polish, or country club connections. I paid competitive salaries, created transparent promotion paths, and gave researchers meaningful participation in the value of what they built. I walked through the pristine glass hallways of my new institute, listening to the hum of cutting-edge servers and the passionate debates of brilliant developers whiteboarding new neural network structures. I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was a self-made female billionaire, a titan of industry, and the sole architect of my own destiny. The media heralded me as a visionary. Business magazines put my face on their covers, praising my ruthless negotiation tactics and my unparalleled technical genius. I had completely rewritten the narrative of my life. I had taken the profound pain of betrayal and weaponized it into an unstoppable force of creation. My parents had tried to bury my worth under layers of social climbing and fraudulent corporate filings. But they had failed to realize one fundamental truth about the technology world. Hardware will always rust, degrade, and eventually become obsolete. But the code, the raw, brilliant logic of a resilient mind that is eternal. The heavy gray clouds rolled over the Atlanta skyline, bringing a torrential downpour that pounded against the floor-to-ceiling glass of my penthouse office. I stood near the edge of the window, watching the rain streak down the thick panes, blurring the city below into a wash of muted colors. The storm outside felt entirely appropriate. It was a violent, chaotic force sweeping away the debris of the past. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored white suit, feeling the quiet, absolute power vibrating through the polished floors of the NIA Data Research Institute. My desk phone chimed with a priority alert. It was the head of my private security detail stationed in the main lobby, 50 floors below. He did not sound alarmed, but his voice carried a note of deep professional caution. He informed me that 3 individuals had managed to slip past the outer courtyard security checkpoint during the heavy rainstorm. They were currently standing in the center of the pristine marble reception area, entirely soaked and refusing to leave. They were demanding to speak with the chief executive officer. They were begging to see me. I did not need to ask for their names. The court dates, civil deadlines, and public filings surrounding the OmniTech dispute had made it obvious that my family was running out of room to maneuver. I stepped away from the glass and walked toward my private elevator. The descent was smooth and completely silent, a stark contrast to the turbulent descent my family had experienced over the last 6 months. The polished steel doors slid open to reveal the expansive sunlit lobby of my institute. The space was normally a testament to cutting-edge innovation, but right now it looked like a crime scene of broken pride. Marcus, Vivian, and Henry stood huddled near the front reception desk, dripping rainwater onto the imported marble tiles. The sight of them actually made my breath catch for a fraction of a second. They were completely unrecognizable. Marcus, the man, whose booming baritone used to command respect from venture capitalists and megachurch congregations, looked entirely hollowed out. His broad shoulders were slumped. The expensive custom-tailored suits he used to wear like armor were gone, replaced by a cheap, rumpled trench coat that hung loosely off his diminished frame. The aggressive arrogance that had defined his entire existence had been thoroughly crushed by the relentless grinding gears of the federal justice system. Vivian stood beside him, trembling violently. The immaculate high society matriarch who had once ruled Atlanta with an iron fist and a string of pearls was entirely shattered. Her hair was unstyled and plastered to her cheeks by the rain. Her face was gaunt, stripped of the expensive cosmetics and the haughty superiority she had weaponized against me my entire life. She looked small, fragile, and utterly terrified. And then there was Henry. My brother had aged 20 years in the span of a few months. Without his sports cars, country club memberships, and the wife who had abandoned him at the first sign of legal trouble, he looked like a frightened child. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken. He was facing a serious federal investigation over the merger representations and the possibility of years in prison if prosecutors charged him and a court ultimately convicted him had stripped away the last of his arrogance. As I stepped out of the elevator, their eyes locked onto me. They did not see the invisible workhorse they used to lock in a basement. They saw their executioner and their only remaining lifeline. Before my security team could step in to intercept them, my father dropped to his knees. The heavy, wet thud of his knees hitting the marble floor echoed through the vast lobby. A second later, Henry collapsed to his knees right beside him, weeping openly, his face buried in his trembling hands. Vivian followed slowly, lowering herself to the ground, her body shaking with loud, desperate sobs. The elite, untouchable family that had thrown me out into the street was now kneeling in a puddle of rainwater at my feet. Nia, my father, choked out his voice, a cracked, pathetic rasp. "Please, you have to help us." I stood exactly where I was, looking down at them. I did not feel a shred of pity. I felt the cold, clinical satisfaction of a mathematical equation perfectly balancing itself out. "Sterling's lawyers are liquidating the collateral. They can lawfully reach Marcus," pleaded, staring up at me with desperate, bloodshot eyes. "They took the house through the lending process. The cars are gone. Prosecutors are discussing possible resolutions with counsel, and restitution is part of those conversations. We have nothing left, Nia. If the criminal case proceeds and Henry is convicted, he could spend years in federal prison." Henry let out a loud, agonizing wail, gripping the wet marble floor with his fingernails. "I cannot go to prison, Nia," he sobbed hysterically. "Please do not let them take me. Chloe took all the money. I have absolutely nothing. I am begging you." Vivian reached a trembling hand out toward the hem of my white trousers, but she did not dare touch me. Nia, my beautiful daughter, she wept, her voice thick with panic and desperation. We were wrong. We were so incredibly wrong. We were blinded by the money and the status. Please buy back the old corporate shell. You have the billions. You can buy the hardware assets for pennies and satisfy Sterling's restitution demands. You can save your brother. You can save your family. Have mercy on us. We are your blood. I looked at the three of them, pathetic and shivering on the floor of the institute I built with the very genius they tried to steal. I thought about the night they dragged me out of the boardroom. I thought about the cold Atlanta sidewalk and the canceled credit cards. I thought about the years of emotional starvation, the relentless criticism, and the profound cruelty they had inflicted on me simply because I did not fit their shallow aesthetic narrative. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my heels clicking sharply against the marble. The day this family threw me out into the street and called me a disgrace. I said, my voice dangerously calm and echoing with absolute finality. Mom said something to me. She told me that family is business. She told me I had no commercial value. Vivian squeezed her eyes shut, letting out a wretched sob as her own toxic words were weaponized directly against her. So today, I continued looking down at the broken patriarch and matriarch who had tried to sell my soul for $10 billion. Today, Mr. Marcus, Mrs. Vivian, this business partner, refuses to negotiate. I turned my gaze to Henry, who was staring up at me with absolute sheer terror, realizing that no one was coming to save him from the consequences of his own staggering arrogance. Call my lawyer, I stated softly. I did not wait for their screams. I did not wait for the wailing to amplify. I turned my back on them and walked straight into my private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut with a smooth, definitive mechanical whisper, entirely cutting off the frantic, desperate cries of the people who had tried to destroy me. The elevator began its rapid ascent back to the penthouse. The ambient music played soft, the temperature was perfectly controlled, and the air was completely clear. I stepped back into my massive sunlit office and walked straight toward the floor-to-ceiling glass. The rain was beginning to clear outside, the thick, dark clouds breaking apart to reveal the bright, piercing blue of the Atlanta sky. I looked directly at my own reflection in the glass, seeing the calm, powerful woman who had engineered her own salvation. I had not just survived the fire they threw me into. I had harnessed the flames and built a global empire. They sold the company for $10 billion, I said, looking straight ahead, my voice steady and thrumming with absolute undeniable power. But they forgot. I am the one who holds it.